All right, so now that we've got that going, I know you're all really familiar with Zoom these days, but just want to let you know that I'm trying to get to the next slide. That the Zoom functions are, as follows. All attendees are currently muted, and during the Q&A, we'll use the raise hand function to make sure that we can address everyone's questions. For the raise hand feature, you will hover over reactions in the lower right-hand corner, and that will bring you up to the raise hand function. If you want to turn your video on, you can do that in the lower left-hand corner. The same goes with the mute and the unmute. And I want to just go over tonight's agenda as well. We're doing the welcome and going to give you some background on this project in just a moment. And then we'll head into the draft study results, conclusions and recommendations with the project team, and save a lot of time for Q&A and just a discussion in general, because the contract for this project does require this meeting prior to finalizing the report. So I'm looking forward to a robust conversation around really like these topics about adapting, anything about your site, anything about the project in general. We've got some time built in for that. If it gets to be too specific, project team will probably have to kind of go back to more of general conversation. You're always welcome to follow up directly with me. My contact will be provided at the end of this meeting, and I'll probably put it in the chat as well, just to be safe. So just wanted to start with a quick background about why the county is doing this assessment. For those of you who attended the previous meeting, these slides may look familiar to you because they are the same, but we just wanted to just set the groundwork for how we got here. So back in 2015, the county conducted a ocean coast sea level rise vulnerability assessment through the CSMART process. And that vulnerability assessment found that the east shore of Tomales Bay and the town of Marshall are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges, and that pier-based and shoreline housing, which act as the first line of defense for Shoreline Highway, are highly vulnerable. The vulnerability assessment found that the east shore faces a unique challenge because the bayside houses inadvertently serve to armor Shoreline Highway from flooding impacts. Shoreline Highway, also referred to as Highway 1, and that the loss or compromise of shoreline houses could impact that highway. Then in 2018, the county's subsequent adaptation report called for further investigation of Shoreline Highway vulnerability along Tomales Bay in the East Shore area to determine whether bulkheads below homes help protect the highway. And if so, the adaptation report recommended to examine a long-term adaptation strategy for those properties. So in response to these reports, a bulkhead vulnerability assessment was decided on as a project in the county's 2018 local hazard mitigation plan. So through FEMA, this project is funded as part of that work. And then I just want to establish what the purpose of this assessment is. This assessment is analyzing existing structures' integrity and continued capability to protect homes, roadways, and other assets from flooding. We wanted to develop several high-level conceptual options for structural rehabilitation, replacement, or improvement. We wanted to raise local awareness of potential sea level rise vulnerabilities to inform individuals or coordinated responses, which we'll definitely focus on as part of this meeting this evening. And it's also a valuable step forward for qualifying for future federal or FEMA project funding based on what we found. This assessment is not a commitment by the county to implement any of these conceptual project options discussed tonight. It's not part of the local coastal plan hazard update, environmental hazard update, pardon me. And it doesn't function as a regulatory or permitting compliance area. So now I'd like to hand it over to our project team. Mike Jewett is going to get going and share his findings with you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming this evening and for your participation and assistance in our first public meeting and in the course of getting our study done. I will start with just a little bit of background. Some of this was covered at meeting number 1, but in case we've got some new attendees, the scope of our project included assessing bulkheads between Nix Cove at the north end and the Marconi Center at the south end. Again, this assessment focused on bulkheads, which is somewhat loosely defined, and in this case, really is defined as protective shoreline works, so to speak. So retaining walls, rock buttresses, earth embankments, things that directly protect existing infrastructure from wave action and flooding. Go next slide, Kathleen. So site inspections, as most of you know, the next step after our first public meeting was to perform on-site inspections of existing bulkheads. Those were all performed by me over the course of 2 different days in the field. We picked days when tides were at their lowest so that we could see as much as possible. All the inspections were performed from the water side of the properties. So everywhere I went, I was walking along below the mean high water line. And for areas that I could not get to on foot, I resorted to a day on the kayak to get around and at least get close enough to some of these structures to draw some conclusions about how resilient they may be. We did not end up, I did attend a meeting that was graciously led by George Clyde, a tour under some of the houses to gain a little more background and get a better up close view of some areas that I couldn't access on foot. And just as a reminder, again, there was no inspection, there was no real interest or consideration of improvements on the properties beyond, again, those bulkheads on the waterfront. So there was no need for me to get on people's properties or otherwise get up beyond the high water mark. Next slide. Again, just as a bit of a rehash, the intent of the study here was really to identify how many, if any, of the existing structures out there are in suitable condition as they sit to potentially limit or mitigate the impacts of future sea level rise. The data we collected was ultimately utilized to create some visualizations and models of the expected impacts, both from sea level rise and episodic coastal flooding. In other words, the intent was to consider both sea level rise as its own hazard, and then in addition, consider higher water levels as a result of a 100-year annual chance, 100-year return interval storm. Lastly, our inspections resulted in an inventory of existing structures throughout the study area. And the intent is to identify which structures are likely to require modification or improvement to resist the effects of the higher water levels expected in the future. Deliverables here. So the kind of meat of our report and the things that we'll focus on a little bit later in this presentation. The goals here are to provide an objective assessment of sea level rise and coastal flood risk based on an inventory of structures and the accumulated data generated from previous sea level studies and our aggregated database. Also included in the report are some conceptual options for mitigating episodic flooding and sea level rise where there are vulnerable structures. And then ideally, this report will serve as a foundation for procurement of future funding to take action and invest in long-term resilience of the whole East Shore community. It is oftentimes studies and reports like this that provide enough basis for project stakeholders to consider either individual or coordinated actions in the instance of, say, applying for grant funding to do something on a regional basis. A few limitations to cover, in addition to what Kathleen mentioned earlier regarding things this report is not. It should be understood that there will need to be future phase of site-specific evaluation for each one of these structures. In 2022, the California Building Code will dictate ultimately that structures to be constructed or modified out there will need to be looked at on an individual basis by a geotech engineer and a structural engineer. Oftentimes, a civil will need to be involved also. So I think in sum, the goal of the report is to provide an overview and some kind of high-level thoughts on how vulnerable the existing infrastructure is, and to provide some concepts on what sort of approaches might make practical and economic sense in the future, and to provide enough data that the next steps could be considered in terms of starting to coordinate preliminary approaches or permitting coordination and things like that. So with that, we'll get into the results of the study. So following my 2 days plus a tour of field inspections, we tabulated all of those field notes. The inspections involved locating each structure with a handheld GIS and making some, both objective and subjective notes regarding dimensions, approximated condition, et cetera, et cetera. Of the bulkheads we looked at, there were 102 individual structures in our database within the study area. They truly could be broken down into 3 categories. The first one is rock slope protection, better known oftentimes as riprap. Usually these are giant rocks and boulders between 1 and 3 feet, oftentimes used to protect the earthen embankment, which in many places is the old rail embankment out there. The next category are retaining walls. There are several different types of walls throughout the study area. The vast majority of them are cast in place concrete walls. There are a few outliers. There are a few concrete masonry walls, AKA block walls. There's a few older stacked and grouted rock walls, and there's a couple of wood walls, but the vast majority are reinforced or unreinforced concrete. And then the last bulkhead type was earthen embankments, which is more often than not suspected to be the original railroad embankment out there, where these are constructed of, well, loosely to moderately compacted soil. Usually they're 6 to 8 feet high. The slopes on the outboard side of the embankments are usually pretty steep, between 2 to 1, and in some cases approaching 1 to 1, which is a little atypical for modern earth embankments. In a few cases, individual sites and or bulkheads are essentially a combination. In most of these cases, they're areas where existing retaining walls have been provided with some kind of rock slope protection, either at the toe or up above. So in terms of condition, we kind of subjectively put these into 3 different categories, being good, fair, and poor. And to define each of those, structures in good condition, those are the structures that really appear to be performing well and don't show any sign of any significant distress at the moment. In other words, there's no reason to indicate they would otherwise need to be modified or retrofitted. Fair condition structures are those which may exhibit slight to moderate distress. This could be minor cracking of the concrete. This could be early stages of rot for wood walls. This could be minor erosion and raveling of embankments or rock slopes. But the bottom line is these are structures which, although they're showing signs of beginning to deteriorate, probably are salvageable and conceivably could be retrofitted back to good condition and made to perform again. Structures in poor condition are typically those that have either failed completely or otherwise exhibit distress to the point where, from an engineering perspective, it doesn't look like much will be salvageable. In many cases, these are concrete walls that have cracked and spalled and deteriorated with exposed rebar and a lot of corrosion. In some cases, they're wood walls where the wood posts have rotted away and the wall has fallen over. These are ones that will need to be completely replaced. As noted in the pie chart, the distribution's relatively even, and if anything, skewed toward the fair to good condition. That said, about a quarter of the bulkheads we looked at are realistically in poor condition. One thing to note at the bottom of the slide there is that it really appears that the driving factor in bulkhead condition is merely age. As a lot of you know, a lot of the development out there is relatively old, and the elements are not kind oftentimes to engineered structures. And it follows that many of the poorer condition structures are those that legitimately look to be some of the older infrastructure out there. The other thing to note is that irrespective of future sea level rise, those poor condition structures likely would require replacement for other reasons in the near future. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. Now that we've discussed the structures, the different types of structures and the relative distribution of what kind of shape they're in, the next step is to talk about sea level rise. As noted in the draft report, some of this analysis builds on the previous ARCOST, our future report, and the previous county study. Per the RFP here, this study considers two different sea level rise scenarios. Based on the tidal levels out at Point Reyes, so this is based on local tide gauges, the quote unquote medium high risk aversion scenario would consist of 1.6 feet of sea level rise between 2040 and 2050. In other words, in the next, well, less than 20 to 30 years, 1.6 feet of sea level rise could become reality under this scenario. As shown there, could be 3.3 feet by give or take 2070 and up to 6.6 feet by about the end of the century. The extreme risk aversion scenario is just what it sounds like, assumes that sea level rise will occur on an accelerated time frame due to extreme climate change. And in this case, 1.6 of sea level rise is estimated to occur by 2030 to 2040, a full decade sooner than the medium high scenario. Likewise, higher levels of sea level rise are also expected to occur sooner under that extreme scenario, where 6.6 feet is predicted by 2075 to 2085. One point that I would like everyone to try and keep in mind for the duration of this presentation is that regardless of the quote unquote risk aversion scenario, one of these estimates, the 1.6 feet of sea level rise, is going to be easily visualized by any of the locals out there as being more or less the same as your current 100-year storm or king tide elevation. In other words, the king tides you saw out there last week, or the last time we had a real deluge and local flooding out there, that may be the everyday by, well, 2040 under the medium high scenario or 2030 under the extreme scenario. It's somewhat convenient that the 1.6 feet of sea level rise happens to be about the same elevation as your current storm water level. All right, and on that note, one of the other main, I think, products and takeaways from this study that I would like everyone to consider is that Adaptation International, Trevor and all his magic, have taken the local tide gauge information and taken the sea level rise projections. And because we were able to use a GIS program for all this and very accurately locate the structures and their relative elevations, we're also actually able to put a hard elevation on water levels. And so, as shown here, under current conditions, your wave action, basically current sea level is at elevation 6.56 feet out there. Under the 100-year storm, water comes up a little more than 2 feet to 8.76. Notice that's just above the 1.6 of SLR shown in the next row. The couple things to consider here are that for the purpose of long-range planning, it's anticipated, at least by the technical folks, that more likely than not, a design would ultimately be driven by the sea level plus storm numbers. In other words, is there a lot of value in designing for sea level rise, but then not for the 100-year storm? Where I'm going with this is the three numbers in red boxes, in a way, could represent minimum bulkhead elevations required to resist sea level rise under each of those scenarios. So in other words, bulkheads that are at 10.7 feet or higher will be able to resist 1.6 feet of sea level rise plus the 100-year storm. Once sea level rises 3.3 feet, all the bulkheads would need to be 12.3 or higher. The long-range scenario, as you may be guessing, really is calling for top of wall elevations above 15 feet. Keep that, I think, in mind for future reference, but the underlying point here is that whether it's individuals or a group project ultimately being considered, these elevations are a big component of the project design. In other words, this is one step done and one thing closer to the finish line, where at least now each stakeholder can look at the elevation of existing improvements and decide, how exposed they are. Next slide. This kind of summarizes the last two slides worth of discussion, where the list of scenarios on the left-hand side here are correlated to those fixed elevations that I was just discussing. So the current scenario, your sea level is basically plus 6.56. The next column, number of bulkheads affected, is effectively the number of bulkheads that interact with the water under this scenario. The bulkheads not affected under current scenario are those where the base of the bulkhead is above 6.56. It's located higher on the shoreline. As of present day, only 3 of the bulkheads were overtopped at the current water level. And in looking at that, I suspect actually that the reality is there's not 3 of them out there. Trevor, we'll go back to that one and figure out why we're showing 3 that are flooding there. Under current storm conditions, likewise, now you're up to 92% of the bulkheads in the study area are exposed to wave action and water. Of those, a little under 10% are getting overtopped. In the next 20 to 30 years, under either of those medium, high, or extreme scenarios, 1.6 feet of sea level and a 100-year storm, now you're looking at 97% of the bulkheads dealing with wave action and water, and more than a quarter of them being overtopped. Under the most extreme scenario where now you've got water at 15.5 feet, all the bulkheads in the study area are getting hit with waves, and a full 75% are overtopped. To backtrack a little bit, the best case scenario for that under the medium high risk aversion is sometime around 2075 to 2085. All right, this is almost exactly the same as the last slide, just a little different visual. From left to right, this reflects the number of bulkheads that are really realistically handling seawater. And as shown here, almost all of them are. There's a few outliers, but under the most extreme scenario, eventually all of them will be working on a daily basis to keep you from flooding. Go to the next slide, Kathleen. Again, this is same visualization, but now for bulkheads that are actually overtopped as opposed to just exposed to wave action and water. The overtopping really is where the flooding is going to happen. At 1.6 feet of sea level rise in a storm, you're still looking at only 6% of these things getting overtopped. By the time there's 3.5 feet of sea level rise in a storm, all of a sudden about half of the bulkheads are overtopped. Again, long range, once you've got the full 6.6 feet, now 75% of the project area is flooded. All right. So this is, again, a kind of a third visualization, and one that I think might help kind of put this together on a slightly more regional or group level. What you're looking at here, each of the vertical bars are representative of the bottom and top of wall elevations. So in other words, the dark gray vertical bars are representative of, well, more or less the shoreline, the ground elevation. The light gray represents the individual bulkhead. The red line, mean higher high water, is more or less your everyday high tide. You'll see that the water level here is just above the high tide line because this includes the wave action elevation. The simple way to look at this is anywhere where the water level overlaps the light gray, those are walls that are underwater. Anywhere where the water level comes up above the top of the light gray, those are walls that are being overtopped. This is laid out in such a way as to represent the whole study area from left to right. So they're north to south. There are 102 little bars on here. So each individual structure is represented here as we go through these next slides. Under current conditions, as you can see, none of the walls really are being overtopped. There's a couple of little outliers about a third of the way through from each end, but otherwise, many of these walls are actually up above the top, the projected wave height as it sits. Go to the next slide, Kathleen. This is current conditions, but now instead of just wave action and high tide, this is considering a 100-year return interval storm. As you can see, all of a sudden, some of these light gray areas, some of these walls are being overtopped. The vast majority now, the base of the wall is underwater, but still the overtopping is relatively local and not super widespread. As a reminder, this condition right here is going to be really reflective of the next slide, which will show 1.6 feet of sea level rise. And there it is, just about the same elevation, same thing, a few walls getting overtopped, most of them, the base of the walls underwater, but not too bad yet. Keep going. So here we are, 1.6 in a storm, adding another couple feet for storm run up. This is the point where a good 20% of the walls in the project area are starting to get overtopped. And then we'll go through here. This is 3.3 feet with no storm. And the next one will include the 100-year storm. And now we're up above elevation plus 12, which is a side note approaching finished floor flood minimums for much of Marin County. As shown here, a lot of these bulkheads now are several feet overtopped. And then lastly, this is the big scary scenario for 2075 to 2085. Here you've got a full 75% of the bulkheads in the study area are well underwater, and the ones that are up above the maximum water level are starting to become outliers. And then here's the worst case is your 6.6 feet plus 100-year storm. And honestly, there will be a few islands out there and a lot of flooding under that scenario. Now that we've talked about the results and the elevations and the deep water and all the scary stuff, on to what to do about all this and some conceptual mitigation strategies. As Kathleen mentioned, and I kind of alluded to, there will not be sort of a one size fits all option out here. There are lots of similarities across individual sites and structures in the study area, but the bottom line is that site-specific conditions, including existing infrastructure, including site geology, those are going to be a huge factor in what ultimately makes the most sense in terms of mitigation for each stakeholder. Geologic hazards also need to be considered as new improvements are designed. The scope of this study included assessing the existing condition of bulkheads and their ability to withstand sea level rise. In order to modify or replace those bulkheads, other hazards, including the potential for seismic shaking, for liquefaction, for slope instability, for things other than sea level rise, will need to be part of that design consideration. In terms of concepts, there are obviously lots of different types of retaining walls. Many of the bulkheads in the area, as we covered, are either concrete or block or timber retaining walls. Those are oftentimes integral to the houses and probably going to be some of the most common bulkheads requiring modification. Without getting into what is and is not able to be permitted for other reasons, several walls could be considered from a practical and geotechnical perspective. One option would be something called soil nails and shotcrete, which would involve drilling through the face of the wall to install steel rebar and then covering that with a coat of shotcrete or mesh. It's one means of salvaging older reinforced concrete walls that still have a little bit of capacity left, but either need to be raised or otherwise strengthened. Cast in place concrete walls could be considered. The only real difference here is these don't necessarily involve the horizontal soil nails and anchors. The trade-off is they're going to require foundation excavations, typically on the water side of the existing bulkhead. And so that may engender some additional cost and challenge figuring out how to build foundations on the water side of things. And then another option could be gravity type retaining walls. These are stacked rock walls, but unlike a lot of the garden landscape walls out there, these are built of bigger boulders and designed by an engineer in consideration of seismic shaking and some other things. So it's a little bit of a midway solution. Other gravity type walls include typical landscape like Versalock, Keystone type block walls. gabion walls, the wire baskets full of rocks. There's lots of options like that that could be considered. Those probably will make the most sense where there are earth embankments that require retrofit or raising because they need a big excavation behind them. So gravity walls are probably not going to be applicable to houses with concrete walls underneath them. It's acknowledged that most likely whatever structural improvement is made is going to have to be at least evaluated and or supplemented by some kind of bioengineering solution. In other words, we all know it can be challenging to get permitted for heavy construction right on the water. There may be some other options that, while they won't necessarily provide any structural reinforcement to existing bulkheads, they might cut down their exposure to sea level rise and therefore the rate of deterioration. Some of these concepts could include living shorelines, such as what's being studied and currently kind of trial run down at Cypress Grove and across the bay in Inverness. This could include things like marshland or estuary restoration. It could be combined with things like a floodable crawl space or with some other creative sort of structural engineering. Some of the hardened structures could potentially be modified. Cast in place walls or block walls could be designed with terraces or steps or open cells for planting or other biomaterial. And then rock slope protection or earth embankments could be designed in such a way to complement or incorporate habitat improvements. So there are a variety, I think, of both traditional structural approaches and slightly less direct mitigation strategies. And again, each site may require a unique combination of these, depending on, again, future study and site-specific conditions. So given all that, recommendations for next steps. I think that one of the themes here has been that it will need to be most likely a bit of a coordinated group effort. This is one of those scenarios in which if one person makes improvements, it doesn't necessarily help them until everybody else is on board. And I think from that perspective, the next logical steps may be, further community engagement for the purpose of exploring funding options. Obviously nobody likes spending money on retaining walls. I don't, you don't, we'd rather go on vacation. It's also a lot of project and, things like economy of scale and simplicity of permitting would go a really long way toward facilitating some action. And I think some community engagement to explore grant money, to explore either, a tax assessment district or a hazard abatement type district to collect funding for regional repairs. Another thing that may be worthwhile as a collaborative effort would be to approach the California Coastal Commission and explore some regional and local approaches to mitigation, really with the goal of developing a streamlined and collaborative approach to permitting these things. Engineering walls, we've provided a hard elevation. We know how high the walls need to be based on how long things are expected to go out there. And one of the big challenges is going to be understanding which of those concept improvements, whether it's structures or bioshorelines, which of those is going to be permissible and how much legwork it will take to get permits for it. And to that end, it would be great if there was a way that the community and the stakeholders could get with CCC and find a way to either streamline the permit applications or come up with a list of more efficiently vetted options. In other words, is there a way to cut down on the plan check? Is there a way to make the required mitigation more clear? Is there a way to save everybody a few years and some steps in the process when there will be several similar projects coming for permits? And again, I think the community collaboration is really going to be critical. And we have reached the end of the prepared presentation. I imagine there will be some questions, and at this point, I will let Kathleen take back over to MC, but we'll be happy to try and answer any questions I can.
Thanks, Mike. As I noted at the beginning, if you have any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you in the order that your hands are raised. And if you want to put your question in the chat, please feel free to do that as well. I'll be reading directly from there if any questions arise. So if anyone's ready to go, please unmute and share your thoughts. Okay, I see that Helene, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Kathleen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the presentation. It was very helpful, but also a little terrifying. So I'm wondering about two things. First of all, it was expressed at the previous meeting that we would not be required to do anything, that this is a study only to anticipate funding and scope and disaster preparedness, but that there was going to be no mandate on property owners to take action. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. This is a study that is providing folks with a baseline of an understanding of what we have coming and what to face and what to start preparing for, but no actual action is required as part of this study.
So then the second part of my question is something that was mentioned in the previous presentation, that in 2022, the California Building Code will require a geotechnical consultant, a structural engineer, and maybe a civil engineer for any future new building and modifications to existing buildings. Could somebody elaborate on that? What are...
Yeah, Helene, what I meant by that is that the structures out there, when they were built, there was no building code. Oftentimes, there are houses that are framed right on top of concrete walls and wood walls that more than likely were not designed the same way we would do it now. The California Building Code requires that we consider things like seismic shaking, and there's a very specific process for how one designs rebar concrete structures to do that. So the point to be made, there's no significant change as of 2022 per se. The code hasn't changed too significantly from the 2019 version or the 2016 version, but the notion is, the point I wanted to express was that each individual bulkhead will require an individual specific evaluation in order to design a construction set of plans. In order for an engineer to design new foundations for a new retaining wall, they will likely need a geotechnical soils report, where typically we would drill a hole, take a sample, do some lab testing, say, here's what the bearing capacity is, here's what the skin friction is, et cetera, et cetera. They will all likely require a soils report. They will all likely, almost certainly require a structural engineer to prepare the plans and design it. The civil engineering component has to do mainly with surveying. In other words, to get permits nowadays to build a wall, one of the things the building and planning department likes to see is that you're building it on your own property. And to that end, unless there's existing surveying out there, from a conservative budgeting perspective, I would anticipate there being a need to have a civil engineer / surveyor on board.
So I understand that, and I want to make sure I'm understanding everything here. You're saying that if a property owner chooses to make improvements to their bulkhead, then the things you just described are the process for developing a plan and getting approval of it. Those are the experts who have to be involved.
Those are the experts who would, at a baseline, be involved in developing construction plans
A
for
voluntary
either new
construction
improvements or remediation.
plan. A voluntary construction.
Yes.
Okay, so what I thought you were saying, and maybe I really would like to hear this, if someone undertakes improvement to their building, their house, will improvement to the bulkhead be triggered? A required improvement to the bulkhead be triggered by modifications to an existing house?
That is from a policy perspective, that's a question for county planning to answer. From a practical perspective, it depends likely on what's proposed with the house. In other words, we do lots of residential projects, and oftentimes there's a need either to build an addition, to replace rotten framing, whatever it is. If the plans require a building permit, my experience is that they will need to have a structural engineer's stamp on it. In order for the structural engineer to design your framing or your addition or whatever, he will need to justify to himself that the foundations are capable of carrying those loads. So I cannot say for sure. There are many instances where minor modifications may not need anything from a practical standpoint. But on the flip side, for things like proposed structural additions, adding another story, almost guaranteed, if the house bears right on the bulkhead, likely going to need some modification. Again, points to clarify, nothing is required as a result of this study. This is merely informational at this point. And that in the future, if and when people should elect to modify or otherwise improve their bulkheads, they should anticipate from a pure engineering perspective that those would be the initial steps in handling that: surveying, soils, structural. Beyond that are a number of considerations that obviously are beyond geotechnical and have mainly to do with permitting. And that's where I'll let the county pick this up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess to pick up on that too, I just want to remind you, right, that this study does not give away site-specific information. So based on this information that we have, I don't know that you have a site that needs to have some sort of work done to improve your bulkhead. So that's part of this process, is that there is not that site-specific information, so that there is this ability for us to have this conversation, and it's not trying to be punitive, and it's not trying to catch you in some sort of difficult situation or put you in a difficult situation. It's just really more an opportunity to share about what to expect and just give you a little bit more information to make those decisions when it comes to what you want to do to your property, or if you can do anything to your property. From the policy perspective, as many of you may be aware, we are still undertaking our local coastal program that's really going to establish like what can be done in the context of development along shorelines. And I can't necessarily speak to the specifics of that at the moment, but I hope to be able to inform you of progress in the near future about what we understand. I let Jack also speak to anything if he feels like he has some information to add, but this is definitely something that we are thinking about and considering while we are discussing things with the Coastal Commission. And we feel that this report really provided us with a lot of information to support that this is a unique area, unique situation. There's only one Tomales Bay in California, right? And we want to definitely preserve the beautiful character of it. And part of that are these historic homes on these difficult sites.
I'm glad to hear you say that.
All right, I see George, you've got your hand up.
Yeah,
Please speak. Yeah.
I want to thank you, Kathleen, and everyone. Really, maybe I should go into a little more detail. This is this study, which I think is extremely valuable for our community. It is really because Jack was able to get a great grant for it, and he and Kathleen and some predecessors have overseen it in a very constructive way, working closely with the community. And I really appreciate the fine quality of this report that Mike Jewett and Trevor Evan have provided. It's really more than I think we ever anticipated. And it provides an excellent basis. It gives a sense of sea level rise. Just for the record, I'm against sea level rise. But that's not going very far. We know that sea level rise is coming, and that it will have a profound effect on our homes and businesses and properties and our community. And I think the key thing from the community's point of view is that there's some period of time, whether it's 50 years, 100 years, some period of time that is decades, where we can hopefully enjoy the properties we have for ourselves and our families and commercial sense of guests and visitors over the years ahead. And that's what this is all about, is trying to maximize in an efficient way and cost efficient way the ability to do that, notwithstanding the fact that sea level rise is coming. So I think I really appreciate the emphasis that Mike gave on the need for the community to work together. We have a very good example, the Marshall septic system, where we were faced with very different challenges, but the community, with a lot of help from the county, rallied together to come up with a solution for that particular problem. Hopefully this is a start towards something like that. That started with a feasibility study and then further studies. It's noteworthy that Stinson Beach, which has very different issues, but it's still sea level rise related, and they have the same goals of trying to protect their homes for as long as they reasonably can. Just got a grant for, well, they didn't, but the county got issued was able to secure funding for a total of $547,000 for the next planning level. And so that's what I think this excellent study provides a basis for, is the next thinking, following up with many of the suggestions that are in the report and the information that's in there. So I really appreciate all of that, and thank you very much for getting us to this point. I think it's a very valuable work that has been done.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, George.
Would anybody else like to speak or raise any questions? Or, as you know, George didn't actually raise a lot of questions, but had some really good comments and takeaway. That's also encouraged as well. We're here to give you our time and hear anything really at this point. It's a very broad next part of this report, right, where this is the draft, and this conversation will inform the final report. So this information is helpful. Oh, Sam, I see that you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. My name is Sam. I'm writing a report on this for the Point Reyes Light. I just wanted to thank Kathleen, George, Mike, and Trevor for all you guys' help. Mike and Trevor for your extremely articulate report. Definitely helped me out a lot in finding information for this. But I just wanted to ask the call. I'm looking for locals to try and talk to about their position on this meeting and assessment. So if anyone here has anything to say and would like to be talked to, please feel free to direct message me on here. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, we're happy to have those contacts just put directly into the chat. And if you see anything of note, go ahead and use that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mhm. I haven't yet seen any comments really in the chat at this point. So oh, Helene, yeah, or pardon me, am I saying your name correctly? Will you pronounce your name so I can say it correct? Helene.
Very
Okay.
close. Thank you
Okay.
for asking. I don't mean to take all the time here, but nobody was raising their hand. I'm just
No, go ahead.
even though it's not site specific, is there a way to find out from the man in the kayak how our particular bulkhead was evaluated, whether we were good, fair, or poor, in a sort of one-on-one way or anything like that? In other words, an expert has looked at our bulkhead. Can we find out what that expert thought?
So this is definitely one for Kathleen, where there was a firewall letter and some very sensitive discussion about how data was compiled and handled and distributed. I suspect that somehow legally that may not be possible, but is something that I think the county needs to speak directly to. One thing I should point out is that I do not know who goes with which bulkhead, right? I know which bulkhead is which and where it's located and how high it is, but I do not know who owns which bulkhead. So as of right now, I can't help you. I'm very sorry.
Let's take that under advisement, and but I do think we've gone a long way because the community wanted it to keep it as anonymous as possible. So, but we'll see what we can do.
Malcolm, please go ahead.
Hi, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thanks for all your hard work. It was really fascinating to listen to the whole presentation. I just had a question for Mike. He might have noticed, well, I'm sure he did notice, just to the north of Tony's, part of the highway has been reinforced using steel sheets driven into the bay or along the shoreline. That seems to me to be an extremely efficient way of shoring up the highway, and also people who aren't actually sitting on bulkhead, their house aren't sitting on bulkheads. I just wanted to ask, firstly, is this probably the most cost-effective way of shoring up the highway? And secondly, it would appear the Coastal Commission are on board with that. Would that be problematic, I think, moving forward, getting the Coastal Commission to allow more of these steel sheets to be driven into the shoreline?
That's a good observation and a good question. A couple of points about steel, those are called sheet piles. And as you alluded to, they're not going to be practical where there's a house on top of an existing bulkhead because you can't drive them without disassembling the house. One problem with steel sheet piles, those are what's called a cantilever system. In other words, picture a fulcrum where the pressure on the back of the wall is trying to make it rotate, and the part of the wall that's underground is the only thing keeping it from doing so. So sheet piles are dependent on being embedded typically about twice as deep as they are exposed. The area you're talking about between Hog Island and Tony's, is that right?
It's just to the north of Tony's. I would say 400 or 500 feet north of Tony's Seafood. So nowhere near Hog Island, just on the tight bend.
Yeah. And that's where I think that one, I can pull it up, but those are likely in an area where there's deeper alluvial soils at the mouth of one of the drainages. It's a concept that could locally apply. It could locally be cost effective where there's sufficient staging area. It makes a ton of noise, and oftentimes our experience trying to underpin things in the water is that driven systems are not good with fish. Usually it's hey, the noise is going to kill the fish and you can't do that. So that's not to say it's totally infeasible, but I expect that compared to the other options I touched on, it's one whose application will be limited to a few select sites based on noise and other environmental considerations and purely site-specific geology. If it's underlain by hard rock, you just can't drive them and they won't work.
I see. Yep.
So that said, one thing I should follow that with, that's an astute observation. Like I said, I did not provide an absolutely exhaustive list of structural options. One of the caveats with engineering is if you can dream it and can afford to build it, well, an engineer somewhere can certainly design it for you. And so there may be some other options not touched on in here. I tried to focus on and cover the ones that, one, our experience is that they're most commonly relatively cost effective and applicable to these sorts of projects and sites, and where they're not reliant on exotic or proprietary materials and systems that might be difficult to get in West Marin. It's already a bit of a price premium building out there because there's one concrete plant and nobody else to do it. And so I think, solutions that are reliant on materials, means, methods that can be applied to multiple sites are probably going to bring down costs for everybody in the end. I would venture to guess at this very early stage that if and where sheet piles ultimately make sense, there'll be the sections of Highway 1 where currently the rock embankment is falling apart and or there's a reason the rock embankment needs to go away.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Of course.
And I guess also if we're speaking in caveats, right? There's so many things to consider as part of these conversations. And it's like you can't necessarily say, well, because they allowed it on the highway, it's going to be okay for private development, because at the end of the day, the Coastal Commission does kind of view private development different from public improvements and things that provide public access to the coast, such as Highway 1. So that's something that will also be considering and further evaluating and discussing with them. Mary, hi. I see you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, I have a smaller comment. Would it be possible to put all of the participants in the meeting on the screen? We're still kind of looking at the presentation screen and can only see about 4 participants. And I know there's many, many more here. If possible, that would be nice. Then my question, on the RFP, it seemed like we were going to, the next phase was maybe to select 3 structures to do a little more, I guess, thorough kind of evaluation. And then there was going to be a little bit of cost analysis. And I'm kind of wondering if he has any idea of like what these kinds of typical repairs or would cost.
Yeah, so I just stopped sharing my screen. I had it up just because I wanted to make sure that people had the right person to contact should they have any additional questions. And I was afraid that with all my technical things that I wasn't going to be able to get it back up. So if that's the case, I'll put it in the chat, but I thank you for that request. And for the RFP does differ from the contract. So, you go out with a big hope and ideas of what you want to get. And then once you have a contract with your consultant, it really gets whittled down to what's realistic and feasible. And Mike can speak probably more to this, but given the site specific nature of every single thing we're talking about here, that conceptual idea really turned into construction concepts that could be feasible for these projects. This could be some maybe more specific project development could occur as another project, like George mentioned. This is the time to kind of gather together and think about those next steps. But given the constraints of this project and the limitations of our contract and just costs in general, it's a tough thing to really get to.
And I can elaborate that on a little bit for you, Mary. A couple of things to clarify. So the task you're referring to, I think, was task 2. And when I wrote this proposal, this was something I remember kind of discussing at the interview, was the task asks for specific evaluation of 3 structures for the purpose of developing, rough cost estimates and conceptual improvements. And I remember having this discussion at the proposal phase and saying, well, when I think about it, to inspect 3 structures, I'm going to drive out there, spend an afternoon looking at 3 structures, drive back. We're going to develop some options, get some costs. But the reality is those 2 structures, we're going to have a really hard time, nailing down cost if those structures have anything to do with a house on top of them, which is already, that's a big chunk of the project site not represented. And 2, we're going to kind of leave out a lot of other scenarios. And so when we were negotiating the contract, what ended up happening was the detailed design development for 3 individual properties morphed into inspection of each individual bulkhead throughout the study area. And I think that one other side note to that, the other overarching reason that I think there's some concern about getting too quick with cost estimates is that I can provide estimated costs for geotech and structural related engineering works. We do retaining walls, foundations, we review bids, not a problem. If and where the bulkhead to be replaced has anything to do with a house on top of it, that's a whole level of evaluation and unknowns that can't be costed without bringing in a structural engineer and looking at the house. The permitting obviously is the elephant in the room. That's a time and cost unknown that we may as well not consider. But lastly is just time frame and the current economy. I mean, I've got engineers' estimates I developed 4 months ago for cities in Marin that already are off base by 10 or 15% because the pricing and the supply chains have changed so quickly that what we did 3 months ago doesn't apply. And so, one thing I thought about, and Kathleen mentioned that the report has not been finalized because, again, per the RFP and contract, this meeting was to precede finalization. It would not be difficult to provide, as usual, with some disclaimers that right now it's 2022 and I don't know what it's going to look like in 2023, but we could provide some information on basic unit costs for some of those common improvements. In other words, if a soil nail wall was being considered, usually those are $200 to $300 a square foot. For a wood wall with soldier beams, maybe it's cost Y. For riprap, it's X amount per yard. But understand that even that is going to be limited by the unknown about what it takes to facilitate getting permits for that and what else may be involved beyond just that pure improvement. So I'd be hesitant. I think from the county's perspective, I'll let Kathleen confirm, but I think that it might be almost a little, I don't want to say disingenuous, but I'm afraid that providing estimated costs in a document that's going to form the basis for future studies and future design development, I don't want to provide something super misleading that stays in the ether there and then leads people down a wrong direction later on. In other words, right now, houses with concrete walls under them, I would tell you right now, 90% of them, soil nail and shotcrete walls, far and away, probably the simplest thing to do. Don't have to deal with the structure. There's a couple minor considerations, but who knows if right now getting epoxy coating on rebar is a problem, and I'm told we're 8 months out from #1 rebar with epoxy coat. Maybe that gets worse and suddenly the price increases by 300%. I can't foresee that, and I would hate to see a collaborative design effort focused on a concept, but based on old price information that then backs you into a corner. I think there's a good time and a place for estimating costs on a big basis, but that some further refinement of which sites are evaluated, it's highly likely that there will be multiple sites that can be fitted with a very similar or identical design. That's not out of the question, but the groupings of sites would be like, hey, these 3 or 4 can go together, they're close enough. It's not going to be 60 of these can all be applied with the same treatment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yeah. Just wanted to follow up just because I was, in the conversation at the very beginning with the RFP and stuff. So I just kind of thought I would just follow up.
I understand. And that was a consideration for me. I mean, I like I mentioned in the first meeting, I live in Marin. I grew up here. I want to make sure that if the county's hiring me to provide a report, that they're getting their money's worth and getting valuable information that allows you as a community to take the next step. And so as we negotiated the contract, I think the summation of that discussion is that there's likely more value for the stakeholders in arriving at a hard elevation for different sea level scenarios, and in assessing how much time do you have before you need to consider this. And I think we've managed to do that. And I would say that, certainly some cost estimating could be performed once those next steps about refining. One other thing that would help is, again, approaching the Coastal Commission and finding out what's going to be a total non-starter, what the preferred approaches may be, and how to go about vetting anything intermediate. I'd hate to cost out a bunch of improvements that it turns out they take one look at and say, nope, try again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And rest assured, that's something we will be doing as we move forward.
I just have one comment on that. I'm Trevor. I did the actual analysis on these, and while we really tried to make sure that there wasn't any locally identifiable information that got included in this report, I got to see behind the curtain, and one thing I noted is Mike made note of the potential for economies of scale. That is, it gets cheaper if you buy more, so to speak, to play a big factor in the future projects. And I would like to note that while the majority of the retaining wall the bulkhead structures in the area are rock slope protection, most people who live there, who own an individual parcel, I believe 54 of the 102 structures we inspected when they're cut up by their parcels were retaining walls under or near houses. And so a lot of the area that is private property and owned is going to be neighbors next to each other, probably with similar wall construction, where perhaps a joint project would benefit all those neighbors. And in those kind of projects, costing would be different as well. So, since we couldn't get into 2 site-specific ideas or concepts, I just want to say that if you're next to a few neighbors who might have a similar problem, your costs could be influenced heavily by how much you're able to cooperate and work together with them on these projects. From design to implementation to follow through as well. So that's a little silver lining, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jack, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to speak?
Yeah. Mike, I wonder if you could give some insight about how people can use those numbers. How do you measure those hard numbers so they can get a sense of like where their bulkhead might be? What's the
Sure.
baseline for those?
So those numbers, those elevations I provided, plus 6.6 feet plus 12.3 feet, those are all relative to North American vertical datum 88, which is the standard modern surveying datum. The bottom line is, to figure out where you're at, you would give a copy of the table in this report to a surveyor and have them take some survey elevation points along the top of your bulkhead and simply compare the elevation at the top of the bulkhead to the projected water level over time. A lot of you may have some existing documentation on your property. If you have a site survey or you have as-built plans of your home, the couple of numbers that I would pay attention to would be, again, the top of wall elevation at your bulkhead, but then also the finished floor elevation of your home. Those are going to be the two critical numbers in terms of homeowners considering what their individual exposure is. Does that answer your question, Jack, or make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, Trevor, you kind of raised your hand. Did you want to add anything to that question?
Well, I had and thankfully I am not an engineer, so I can say things like this and hopefully not get in too much trouble. A broomstick is about 6 feet tall. And it just so happens that you may have access to the high tide where you all live there. And so at the highest point of the high tide, which happens a couple times a day, you could take a 6-foot broomstick out and simply go to where the high tide line reaches. And and it can simply with visual inspection get a general impression, halfway up is about 3 feet and halfway up that's about 1.5 feet, 1.6 feet. And it's just a crude measure. But ultimately, it's if you're just trying to get a feel for what this looks like, and as Mike said earlier, a big storm also rather accurately predicts, it seems like, especially in your area with your relatively steep cliff, fall off that you have. These kind of existing signals can give us a general idea. Surveyors are going to be essential, of course, before any plans are put in place. But it just is. It is what it is. It's just a few feet from high tide, as it exists now, on average. So.
And let us know. We'd like to come out and see it with you. We'll bring our brooms too. Georgia, do you see you've got your hand
Very,
raised?
very quickly on that, Trevor, our high tides vary from 4 feet to 7.2 feet. So to get that, really to understand it, you should look at a really high tide, like a king tide. That's about a 7-foot tide. By all of the measures you're using. So people can use that as a reference. Just go out there and look and photograph your pilings at that time. What I wanted to add is to the work in the community and the fine comments that Mike said, is we also have another neighbor who's got to be a player in this, and that's Caltrans. Kathleen said that incidentally we protect the highway. The highway and the railroad were there first. We are the incidental components to that. And we are the reason partly that there is a highway and many of our homes protect it. And any serious mitigation of adaptation to sea level rise has got to include Caltrans and their capabilities and funding and all of that. We're just a small blip on the highways that they have to consider in California. But they need to look at our particular stretch of the highway as all of these.
Yeah, and I can say that we have shared this draft study with Caltrans. They were unfortunately not able to attend this evening, but I will be sharing the presentation as well, the recording, and they have indicated interest in meeting with the community at some time when we can get a good group together to discuss. They have been willing to coordinate that and participate. So I think that there's some promise there for that. Well, I don't see any other comments or questions or hands raised. And I do want to be, again, respectful of everybody's time. We're getting close to 7 o'clock. So if anyone has like any short comments or questions, we got probably time for about one more. If not, again, you're always welcome to submit comments to us, questions, give me a call. We're always available within business hours, of course. But I'm happy to discuss this further. And really, we are here to be a support to you all. Like that is something that we feel is important as part of this project and as part of your local government. So please feel free anytime to reach out. And I'll note too that Mike will be using the next month. The contract does end August 31st. So we have about a month to wrap up the final report, and that will also be posted online. And I guess since I also had sent out emails to a lot of folks about this, we do have some communication and outreach that we can do to make sure that this final report does get to as many people as possible. So we'll be coordinating that. And I thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great evening.
And I just want to say thank you to you all for your engagement and interest. These meetings have made it easy to work on this project, even though it's a lot of very technical. The spreadsheet had 13,000 cells at one point, and I just, I'm glad it's going to some people who care about their community. So thank you all. Hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thanks. All right.
Thank you, everybody.